My name is Vorath-Sel. I am a senior field analyst for the Galactic Consensus Bureau of Threat Classification. I have spent 47 orbital cycles cataloging species across 19 star systems. I have watched civilizations rise. I have watched others crumble into debris fields. I have filed reports on predators that could swallow moons, on microorganisms that dissolve starship hull plating like warm breath on glass. Nothing in 47 cycles prepared me for what happened at the Caldris Trench. Let me begin from the beginning, because if I do not explain this carefully, you will laugh at me, and then you will read what comes next, and you will stop laughing, and then you will sit very, very quietly, staring at the wall. The planet Earth is, on paper, unremarkable. Class M biosphere, single sapient species, mid-tier technological development at the time of first formal contact. The dominant species, which calls itself human, is bipedal, warm-blooded, and distressingly fragile-looking. 2 soft eyes, no natural armor, no venom, no echolocation, no thermal sight, no magnetic navigation, teeth that would embarrass a juvenile prawn fish, claws that would not scratch plasteel even if the human were trying extremely hard and also crying. The Consensus Council classified them as Category 3, non-threatening, observation pending. Standard protocol. Everyone nods. Nobody worries. That was our first mistake. The second mistake came shortly after, when Admiral Dreth-Kavoss of the 3rd Expansion Fleet decided that the Caldris system, which Earth had already staked a mining claim on, was actually quite valuable, and that humans, being Category 3, would politely leave if asked. He assembled 12,000 soldiers from 11 different species, professional soldiers, veterans of actual wars. He sent them to the Caldris Trench mining installation, which was staffed by approximately 900 humans. 900. I want you to remember that number. Dreth-Kavoss sent 12,000 soldiers to remove 900 unarmed miners, except they were not entirely unarmed, as it turned out. But we will get to that. I was assigned to observe and document. I arrived on the command vessel 3 days before the operation. The briefing room smelled like victory. Dreth-Kavoss had his chest plates polished. His aides were already writing the post-operation report, because nobody anticipated this taking more than 4 hours. There was a meal planned for afterward, a celebration. I sat in the corner and read my background files on humans for the 3rd time. Something kept bothering me. A small thing, a detail that itched the back of my processor like a splinter I could not locate. Humans were Category 3, non-threatening, but buried in the subfiles, under a section titled Cultural Anomalies Low Priority, there was a single paragraph, a note from a junior analyst who had spent 6 months embedded with a human research colony. She had written, in the dry, bureaucratic language of our bureau, the following observation: subject species displays an unusual and persistent tendency to engage in voluntary simulation of high-stress scenarios. They call this training. The duration and intensity of these simulations exceeds any apparent necessity. When questioned, subjects explain that they do this because, quote, you never know. The psychological and physiological adaptations produced by extended training remain poorly understood. Recommend further study. The file was dated 11 years before the Caldris operation. Nobody had followed up on it. I highlighted the paragraph and sent an inquiry to the Bureau. The Bureau responded that the junior analyst had since been reassigned, that the file was low priority, and that my role was observation, not analysis, and perhaps I should focus on documenting the operation rather than reading old footnotes. I closed my screen. I watched the 12,000 soldiers board their dropships. I noticed distantly that the atmosphere readings from the Caldris Trench installation had been slightly unusual for the past 72 hours. Small things, ventilation reroutes, minor power fluctuations, the kind of data noise that automated systems generate and nobody monitors closely. I monitored it closely. The dropships descended. Communication channels opened. Dreth-Kavoss opened the formal declaration of consensus authority, which humans were legally required to acknowledge and comply with. It was a 7-minute speech, very official, very impressive. The humans acknowledged it. Then a voice came back over the channel. It was calm, slightly hoarse, the way some human voices are, like the speaker had been talking for a long time or had recently been through something physically demanding. The translator rendered it with that particular human vocal quality that our systems always flagged as unusual tonal confidence. The voice said, very simply, "We've been expecting you." There was a pause. Then it said, "Please note that we have had 72 hours. Dreth-Kavoss frowned. He asked what that meant. The voice did not explain immediately. Instead it said, "How many soldiers are in your first wave?" Our first wave was 4,000. Standard breach protocol. Overwhelming numerical advantage. Textbook. The voice said, "That's going to be a problem for them." Dreth-Kavoss laughed. His aides laughed. I did not laugh. I was looking at my atmospheric readings, which had just shifted again. The ventilation systems in the Caldris installation were now routing in a pattern that made no sense for a mining operation. They made sense for something else entirely, something I had read about once, in a different sub-file, under the heading Human Military History Archaic Tactics. I pulled up the file. I found the entry I was looking for. Humans have a word for the specific thing they were doing. The word is channeling. It refers to the deliberate restructuring of physical space to control where an enemy can and cannot go, to funnel them, to remove their options, to ensure that their numbers, which should be an advantage, instead become a disadvantage, because they cannot all fit through the spaces available. 900 humans had spent 72 hours turning a mining installation into something that was no longer, in any meaningful operational sense, a mining installation. The first wave went in. I will not describe what happened in detail, because I have professional standards and also because Dreth-Kavoss later made me promise not to include certain specifics in my official report. What I will say is this: the first wave had 4,000 soldiers. They had armor. They had weapons rated for Class 7 conflict. They had tactical coordination systems worth more than most small planets. They had officers who had won actual wars. The tunnels of the Caldris Trench are narrow, very narrow. When you design a mining installation, you optimize for ore extraction, not for wide corridors. The passages branch constantly and turn at unpredictable angles, because ore seams do not run in straight lines. The lighting, as it happened, had been almost entirely disabled in the 48 hours before the operation. Not the emergency lighting, which is a dim, sickly amber color that is apparently quite sufficient for human vision but does very strange things to the threat detection systems of 8 other species in the coalition force. The 900 humans had distributed themselves throughout the installation in small groups, very small groups, groups of 3 and 4. They were armed with what our initial scan had classified as mining equipment, which was technically true, and also, we discovered, not the complete picture, because certain categories of mining equipment share a great deal of engineering DNA with certain categories of weapons, and a human who has been running simulation drills for 72 hours with 8 hours of sleep in between is apparently capable of doing things with a pressurized drill head that our analysts would later spend 4 months arguing about in terms of classification. The 4,000 soldiers met groups of 3 and 4 humans in dark tunnels for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, our first wave fell back to the surface. There were 2,800 of them. Dreth-Kavoss stared at his display. He was very quiet. His polished chest plates caught the light. He said, "How?" Nobody answered. Outside, through the view screen, the Caldris installation sat in the rock of the asteroid, silent, its ventilation system still cycling, its amber emergency lights still casting their pale glow over the entry corridors. And then the channel opened again, the same voice, still calm, still slightly hoarse. "Second wave," the voice said. "We are ready when you are." I filed an immediate urgent advisory to the Bureau. I used language I had never used in an official document before. I wrote, "Recommend immediate reclassification. Category 3 designation appears to be critically incorrect. Humans are not non-threatening. Humans are something we do not currently have a category for." I attached the ventilation schematics. I attached the casualty reports. I attached the footnote from the junior analyst, the one about training, the one about you never know. I pressed send. Then I looked at the view screen, and I thought about 7,000 more soldiers. And I thought about 900 humans who had just spent 6 hours in the dark and had apparently decided they were not done. And I felt, for the first time in 47 orbital cycles of professional threat analysis, something that I later identified, after extensive research into human psychological literature, by its correct name, Dread. Dreth-Kavoss did not send the second wave immediately. This surprised everyone. The Admiral was not known for hesitation. He had flattened 3 resistance outposts in the Vena cluster without pausing long enough to drink water. His career was built on forward momentum, on the principle that delay gave the enemy time to think, and that enemies who had time to think became enemies who caused problems. He was apparently willing to make an exception for humans. He sat in his command chair for 11 minutes without speaking. His aides stood around him like decorative plants. Nobody made a sound. The casualty numbers from the first wave sat on the main display, glowing softly, as if embarrassed to be so large. I used those 11 minutes productively. I pulled every file I could access on human psychological behavior under sustained threat conditions. I was looking for something specific, a pattern, something that would tell me whether the voice on the channel, the calm and slightly hoarse voice that kept saying terrifying things in an unremarkable tone, was performing confidence or actually had it. I found a paper. It had been written by a human researcher studying her own species, which is a thing humans do with remarkable frequency and very little apparent self-consciousness. The paper was titled Stress Inoculation and the Paradox of Trained Calm. It explained that humans who underwent extended high-stress simulation training did not simply become better at managing fear, they became over time genuinely less afraid of the things they had trained for. Not because the danger was reduced, because the brain through repetition reclassified the dangerous situation from emergency to familiar problem. The paper used a phrase I copied into my notes immediately. The phrase was comfortable in the fire. 900 humans had been running drills on this installation for, our records now showed, not 72 hours but considerably longer. The 72 hours was just when the ventilation reroutes became visible. The actual preparation had started 11 days ago, 2 days after a consensus trade vessel had passed through the system and a sharp-eyed human communications officer had noted its sensor sweep pattern and apparently told someone important. 11 days. They had 11 days to become comfortable in their fire. Dreth-Kavoss finally spoke. He said he wanted a communication channel to the human installation commander. Not the standard consensus authority frequency, a direct channel, private. His aides scrambled. The channel opened. The same voice answered. Of course it did. Dreth-Kavoss introduced himself. He listed his titles, he explained, with what I must admit was considerable diplomatic restraint for a being who had just lost 1,200 soldiers in 6 hours, that the consensus authority had a legal claim to the Caldris system, and that continued resistance was both futile and inadvisable. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then it said, Admiral, my name is Commander Yusuf Adisa. I want to be very straightforward with you. Dreth-Kavoss said that he appreciated directness. Commander Adisa said, we have 41 people with injuries that need medical attention. We also have 116 of your soldiers in custody. They are not harmed. We gave them water. We would like to discuss an exchange. Dreth-Kavoss looked at his aides. His aides looked at each other. Nobody had told them there were captured soldiers. The first wave's after-action report had listed those individuals as casualties. One of the aides whispered that perhaps the humans had different definitions of the word casualties. I did not say anything. I was busy writing very fast. Dreth-Kavoss asked Commander Adisa what he wanted in exchange for the captured soldiers and for agreeing not to continue the engagement. There was a pause. I imagined, though I could not see him, Commander Adisa sitting somewhere in the amber-lit tunnels, probably drinking something warm, probably looking at a list he had prepared earlier. Commander Adisa said, the Caldris mining claim, recognized by the consensus, full legal protection, 50-year term. Dreth-Kavoss laughed. It was a shorter laugh than before, less comfortable. He said that was not a negotiating position, that was an absurdity, that the consensus was not in the business of granting concessions to species who attacked consensus forces. Commander Adisa said, very politely, Admiral, with respect, you attacked us. There was a pause. Commander Adisa continued, I also want to point out that we still have 763 personnel in this installation, fully operational. We have resupplied from stores. We know these tunnels better than your soldiers know their own barracks. You have 7,000 troops left. I am not trying to be threatening when I say this, but I would like you to do the math before you make a decision. Dreth-Kavoss ended the channel. He sat for another 6 minutes. Then he did something that I found genuinely remarkable. He turned to me, the bureau analyst, the observer in the corner who was supposed to be silent and neutral and documentarian. He looked directly at me and he said, "You have been reading files since we arrived. What do you know about these creatures?" I told him about the footnote, about the junior analyst, about you never know. I told him about the paper on stress inoculation, about comfortable in the fire. I told him that the Caldris installation had, as of our best current intelligence, effectively 0 tactical weaknesses that his remaining 7,000 soldiers could exploit without inflicting the kind of casualties that would require a very lengthy explanation to the Consensus Council, the kind of explanation that would end careers and possibly result in criminal proceedings, given that the original operation had been approved on the basis of a non-threatening species assessment that was now self-evidently wrong. Dreth-Kavoss was quiet. I told him one more thing. I told him that Commander Adisa had offered water to the captured soldiers, that this was consistent with documented human behavioral patterns around captured enemies, and that it was not a tactic, it was simply what they did. I said that a species that gives water to the soldiers sent to remove them is a species that is operating from a position of profound psychological stability, and that this was, in my professional assessment, the most concerning data point of the entire engagement. Dreth-Kavoss looked at me for a long time. Then he opened the channel again. The negotiation took 4 hours. I transcribed all of it. Dreth-Kavoss was not a man who surrendered gracefully, but he was a man who, when presented with mathematics that could not be argued with, eventually stopped arguing. Commander Adisa was patient. He answered every objection. He made 2 minor concessions that were face-saving for the Admiral and meaningless in practical terms, and he did this with what I could only describe as a kind of quiet generosity, as if he understood that Dreth-Kavoss needed a way to walk back through the door with something in his hands. The 116 captured soldiers were returned, all present, all in good health, several of them apparently having eaten better in custody than they had on the dropships. Our forces withdrew. The Caldris claim was formalized 3 weeks later. 50-year term, full consensus recognition. The junior analyst who had written the original footnote was located and promoted, somewhat belatedly. The Category 3 classification for humans was suspended pending review. The review took 8 months. I wrote 43 pages of the final recommendation myself. We did not have a category that fit. We created one. The Council argued about the name for almost as long as they argued about the classification criteria. What we eventually settled on was a designation that has no clean translation into most languages, but which renders roughly in standard script as prepared, not aggressive, not hostile, not militaristic. Prepared. There is a meaningful difference. It took me those 8 months to articulate it properly. An aggressive species attacks. A militaristic species builds forces and expands. A prepared species does something subtler and considerably more unsettling. It looks at every environment and quietly asks, what would I do if this became dangerous? It runs drills. It studies failure. It reads old reports. It routes ventilation systems. It trains until the fire is familiar. And then it goes about its daily work with every answer already loaded. And it waits, without anxiety, without obsession, simply with a kind of ready patience, for the question to be asked. 900 miners, Dreth-Kavoss had said to me, on the last night before we left the Caldris system. He was staring out at the asteroid. The installation lights were back to full brightness. You could see the ore transports moving in and out, slow and deliberate, doing exactly what they had been doing before 12,000 soldiers arrived to tell them to stop. 900 miners, he said again. I told him yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, my report is going to say that there were additional fortifications not detected by pre-operation survey. I told him that was inaccurate. He said he was aware of that. He said, there were no fortifications, there was just preparation. I told him that was the most accurate summary of events I had heard. He nodded slowly. He kept looking at the lights on the asteroid. The ore transports kept moving. He said, what happens when they are not miners? I did not answer, because I did not have an answer that would have made either of us feel better about the next 47 orbital cycles. I closed my datapad. I filed my report. I flagged it urgent, maximum priority, council distribution. The subject line read, Caldrus engagement, final assessment. The first line of the body read, we have been wrong about humans. I recommend we determine the full extent of that error before they determine it for us. 12,000 soldiers had gone down into that asteroid. 7,000 came back. Every single one of them had looked at those amber-lit corridors and learned the same lesson in the most direct way available. The ones who came back broken were not broken by injuries. They were broken by the specific hollow feeling that arrives when you are a trained professional who has just discovered that the beings you came to remove were, in every sense that matters, more prepared for you than you were for them, and they were not even soldiers. That was the part that stayed with me. That was the part I put at the very end of my 43 pages. 900 humans in a mining installation, with ore drills and amber lights and 72 hours of warning. Not soldiers, just people who had decided, somewhere along the way, to know what to do,